In this movie, I'll share a few tips and tricks for working with adjustment layers. For starters, notice this layer right here is called Brightness Contrast 1. That's Photoshop's automatic name, but I'm not a big fan of those names because they don't really explain what it is the layer is doing. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this layer by double-clicking on its existing name, and I'll just go ahead and call it Darken because that's its job. All right, now I'm going to switch over to the other image here. And let's say I decide I want to re-express this color adjustment as a dynamic adjustment layer. Well, if I go up to the Edit menu, the Undo command is dimmed, and that's because it wasn't really the most recent operation I applied. In fact, I've saved this image since I applied the static adjustment. So what I need to do is go to the Window menu and choose the History command to bring up the History panel right here. And you can see there's just two operations, the Open operation and Brightness Contrast. Well, let's say that I decide I want to start things in a new image window. Then I could click on Open right there, and then I could drop down to this little page with a plus sign in it and click on it, and that is going to open that open state inside a new image window. And that way this guy can remain the way it was, and I can keep him open on screen, at least for the sake of comparison. And so I'll just go ahead and click on the Brightness Contrast state to bring it back, and then I'll hide my History panel. And now I'll switch over to this image, which is called Open, and I'll zoom in a bit. All right, now let's say you want to create an adjustment layer and name it at the same time. Well, one way to work is to go up to the Layer menu, choose New Adjustment Layer, and then choose Brightness Contrast, and that will force the display of the new layer dialog box. Here's another way. I'll go ahead and cancel out there. Go to the Window menu and choose Adjustments to bring up the Adjustments panel, and then press the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac and click on the Brightness Contrast icon. And because you press the Alt or Option key, you're reversing Photoshop's behavior and you're forcing the display of that dialog box. And now I'll just go ahead and call this guy Contrast, let's say, and click OK in order to create that new layer. Now I want you to see how blend modes can affect empty adjustment layers. So let's say I decide to do nothing to the brightness or contrast values. I just decide to hide the properties panel. Why then I can still experiment with my blend modes. So click on the word normal in the upper left corner of the layers panel. Now, I've mentioned this before, but I am going to be devoting an entire chapter to blend modes in my advanced course. But for now, there are two blend modes that really stand out. One is multiply, which will allow you to darken the image. So what we're doing is we're using the image to darken itself. So we're multiplying the image into itself, which is a darkening process in Photoshop. Or if you want the opposite effect, you can apply screen. So the second of the darkening modes here is the really great one, multiply, and the second of the lightening modes is the really great one, screen. And notice if I choose screen, then I'm going to use the image to brighten itself. If you want contrast instead, and I know I'm throwing a lot at you here, then you drop down to the next group of blend modes. So we've got the darkening modes, we have the lightening modes, and then we have the contrast modes. And the most useful of them all is the very first one, overlay. And that's going to increase the contrast of the image, even though I haven't changed a single numerical value. So this is what the photo looks like before I correct it. And this is what it looks like when I apply overlay to an empty adjustment layer. Now, at this point, I need to brighten the image a little. To bring back the properties panel, all you have to do is double-click on the thumbnail for that adjustment layer, and then your values will appear on screen. Now, let's say I want to select this first value. I can click inside of it, or I can click on the word brightness if I prefer. But here's a trick that was actually suggested by a member of my website, Deek.com, that Adobe paid attention to and implemented, and that is Shift-Enter here on a PC, that Shift-Return on the Mac. So anytime you press Shift-Enter or Shift-Return, that's going to highlight the first value here inside the Properties panel, and then I can press Shift-Up arrow a bunch of times, a total of 7 times, in fact, in order to increase that brightness value to 70, and then I'll press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac to accept that change, and I'll go ahead and click on this double arrow icon to hide the Properties panel. And there you have it, a handful of tips and tricks when using adjustment layers. You can Option-click on an adjustment icon in order to name that adjustment layer as you create it. You can assign blend modes to adjustment layers, including multiply to darken, screen to lighten, and overlay for contrast. And you can press Shift-Enter or Shift-Return on the Mac in order to highlight the first value inside the Properties panel.